This is IAT814 Visual Analytics.
Lecture 6.2. Previously, we talked about nonlinear perception, and we're going to continue on that theme with the theme of integral versus separable. We'll get to what that means right now. So, here, the question that's going to drive this segment of the lecture is, can you develop a set of unique symbols that can be placed on a display and be rapidly perceived and differentiated here? Whereas with the previous thing about nonlinear versus linear perception, we were aimed at a kind of a strong goal, which is to be able to pick a number off from a visual depiction and have that number be the same as the number that the visualization intended to draw, so to speak. Here we're going to talk about something that's a little less a weaker goal, and that is, they be rapidly perceived and differentiated from each other? The goal is a little less, mainly because we've talked about the visual dimensions that can be readily used to pick off numbers. Now we're going to talk about things where the goals are a little less strong. So suppose that we have two different visual properties to encode two different variables in a discrete data set. The reason why we're saying two is with one visual variable, it's comparatively easy. So let's say you're drawing circles for everywhere. Setting, say, the size of that circle might be okay, right? You might be able to pick off the area of that circle in order to tell you something. And if it's intended to depict a nominal or a categorical variable, the large circles stand for, large restaurants, the medium circles stand for medium restaurants, and the small circles stand for small restaurants with only a few seats in a mapping display of restaurants. So let's say you want to do something more, not only talk about restaurant size, seating capacity, but also say, quality or Yelp rating or something like that. So what you would like to do is to be able to use some visual thing such as color, size, shape, lightness, other visual attributes of stuff you're drawing on a map or some other display to be able to depict two variables that are of interest in your visualization. Will the two different properties, however, the question is, will the two different properties interact such that they are more or less difficult to untangle? And the terminology that we're using for this is integral versus separable. Integral means that the two properties are viewed holistically. We'll show an example in order to make sense of what that means. Separable means that we judge each of the visual dimensions independently of each other. And we'll just have blindingly obvious separable and blindingly obvious integral, and we'll talk about the in-betweens, the things that are a little separable, a little integral, that kind of stuff. Okay, so let's keep going. So the way these things work is there are certain types of glyph properties that you can combine, and depending on which ones you choose, they are viewed either closer to the integral end of the spectrum, as it were, if you excuse the pun, or separable. So let's start with separable. So the X and Y position are separable from each other. The X position can be read independently of the Y position, particularly if we provide an axis to be able to judge them. Even better if the axes have numerical tick marks. We can also pick off X and Y position from the size or the shape or the color of the individual glyph mark. So if you're plotting squares, circles, and triangles at different XY locations, you can easily tell that the X value of this one is different from the X value of the triangle is different from the X value of the circle. You don't mix those things together. Another thing that is separable is the color of something and its direction of motion. You can easily tell that the direction of motion is a different thing than the color of it. Similarly, color and shape are separable, and the direction of motion and shape are separable. But as we're going up this scale, we're getting closer and closer to things that are integral. So the classic suite of integral things is if you try to mix, say, a value by picking off a line in the CIE diagram or just turning a knob on red to green, and you mix that with some other color that is yellow mixed with blue, and you just add those two colors together to get some composite color, those things end up being viewed as an item of the resulting composite color. You're just very, very hard pressed to pick out the red-green component from the yellow-blue component. Similarly, red-green from black and white, that is, sort of light red, light green from dark red, dark green. It's a little bit easier, but it's still hard to do. Next is the shape height and shape width. We'll show examples from that. Typically, let's say you're drawing a circle, think of a tall ellipse versus a short, fat ellipse. We'll show examples of that. And shape and size are and color and size are in the middle. So let's show visual examples of what that's about. So here at the top end are integral visual variables. So here we're mixing, red and green and blue and purple or something. Mixing red and green with yellow and blue. And instead what happens is we view these as 3 green dots, 3 purple dots, 3 red dots, and 3 bluish dots. What's happened is the mixing of red and green and yellow and blue is giving us 4 separate categories of 4 independent colors. If we mix X size with Y size here, we can sort of see that there are short, fat ellipses and tall, thin-ish ellipses, big circles and small circles, but we tend to view them as circles, not as X and Y height equal and large compared to small. We get a little easier if we're mixing size and orientation, right? So where this size is either big or small, so those are big ones, and the rotation is either vertical or rotated to the left. We can kind of separate those two. We can separate more easily color versus shape. So red triangles and red circles versus blue triangles, black triangles and black circles. And that's similar to the combined thing of the pre-attentive stuff we were talking about in lecture segment 5.1. Color and motion, you have to imagine that these are moving blue things versus non-moving blue things. You can tell those things apart. And here, the easiest things to separate is location and color. So you can see there's 2 groups, the left group and the right group, right? And there's, within each of those groups, there's 2 other groups, the green and the black. So those are separable. And the range is, these are more easily separable, those are integral. And, there's just this range. And so when you're designing visualizations, basically what you need to do is pick off the easy ones first, location and color, and as you want to add more and more visual dimensions, you're going to work more and more towards things that don't work well as a means of depicting a value that you can then have the viewer, the user, reconstruct in their head. And that's what the game's all about here, is enabling the user or the viewer to reconstruct the values in their head. From Munzner's book, we have a similar set of visual illustrations. The fully separable ones are position and hue here, size and hue, and her annotation is they're mostly separable. Small items are hard to see, which is another problem of using size, just generally speaking. There's interference when you're mixing width and height. Size is an integral percept, and over here on the right is full interference. Hue is an integral percept. We're mixing red and green and getting a whole bunch of different colored dots. Here's further annotation of the same idea. Here we see 2 distinct groups. Here we see 3 groups. The big circles, the small circles, and the ellipses maybe. And here we have 4 groups, and essentially what that means is there's 4 separate hues that are present in these scenes. The idea, however, is the intent of the visualizations would be to group these, would be to depict things as if they were 2 separate groups, and here that's not succeeding well. Last, I just thought I'd mention something. I did an experiment a number of years ago in the 90s in which I used this thing called superquadrics. Superquadrics are a range of shapes. I'm showing you the entire vocabulary of shapes here pretty much, in which you control a couple of parameters to create a smooth surface. It's polygonized, but essentially the underlying thing are smooth curves. And you can get shapes that range from a cube to sphere. This is almost a sphere. It isn't actually a sphere. To this kind of cross-shaped that looks like it's a balloon with all the air sucked out of it. And you could easily perceive the difference of these shapes, but the value of these things was as separate categories. I did a little experiment in order to determine just noticeable difference, and I kind of rediscovered that it's kind of interesting. People are really good at telling when something's a sphere versus something that's not a sphere. So there's a non-linearity around here if you're playing with the numbers. And you can tell something's a cube versus a cube with smooth corners. But, you know, once you get smooth cornered, you know, really smooth cornered or rounded cornered thing, you could, if you think about it, you could put a name on it, but that's not necessarily what you want with visualizations. So there's all sorts of ways in which you can continue to explore the visual vocabulary. And I'm just simply mentioning another one here. Okay, that's it for integral versus separable. And so once again, our goal is to use numbers to drive visual variables in the visualization in such a way that when the user looks at that visualization, they are able to come up with the numbers that you used to depict things. And there are some things that are, you know, really work well, position and size to a smaller, to a lesser degree, and some things that don't work well at all is if you're using, you know, the numbers to, you know, pick off the amount of green combined with another number to pick off the amount of red. That last idea, that won't work well at all. So be forewarned.